Welcome to the Startup of the Year podcast, where each episode we showcase exciting new companies from around the world. This podcast is produced by Established, creators of the Startup of the Year program. Established is focused on helping organizations with their innovation, startup, and communication strategies.
All right, welcome to the Startup of the Year podcast live. I'm your host, Frank Gruber, and today I'll be talking with Aubrie Pagano. She's an alum of the Startup of the Year community, has been with us back before we called it the Startup of the Year, I believe. And also has, after selling her company, Bow Drape, she moved into venture capital as a general partner at Alpaca VC, which I don't know if you know this, but I have a love for alpacas and llamas. So I'm very envious of your work creating a company that's called Alpaca. That is like amazing. And it gives me some goals for life. Eventually, maybe there's, another thing I could do in the alpaca space. But welcome, Aubrie. Thanks for being here.
Excited to be here. And it's good to see you and reconnect in this new, it's so fun because the startup world's so small. There's all these ways that you reconnect over the years. So it's fun now to be an investor and be chatting.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's get everyone on the same page here. Tell us a little bit more, for those that are unfamiliar, what is Alpaca VC? I, first think of your farmers of alpacas. That's not what you're doing. So can you share a little bit more what you're up to?
We always threaten that we're going to buy an alpaca farm because it can.
I will be the first employee, come or just amazing. Observer. I don't even need to be an employee. I just want to go see them.
Noted.
Yeah.
So Alpaca VC is an early stage fund based primarily in New York. And what we do is we're all former operators turned investors, and we love investing in businesses that touch the real world. And so we think about the intersection of the digital and physical world as this interesting kind of new liminal space that a lot of investors are unafraid of. And we're sort of unafraid of physical spaces, the people, processes, places that move modern commerce. And so we've built businesses in real estate, commerce, supply chain, fintech. And so we love investing in those businesses and helping them get from 0 to 1. So when we say early stage, we're really pre-seed and seed investors. We'll lead or co-lead rounds. So call that $1.5 million check, something like that. And then we sit really deeply with our founders. We sit on their boards. We help them get to the next level because we've all been in their seats and believe we can be, a solid partner to get you to your next phase.
That's great. And to hear you're leading is awesome. We interact with a lot of different startups. They're always looking for a lead, I feel like. So it's good to hear that somebody's actually doing it. Obviously not in every space, but in the spaces that you're looking at.
100%.
Okay, so tell me a little bit more. So folks that may not be as familiar with your other ventures, can you share a little bit about your background and how you kind of ended up at Alpaca?
Yeah, so the hopefully short is, so I had always been sort of entrepreneurial in college. I had started nonprofits and NGOs and graduated, wanted to learn more about business. So worked in finance for almost 5 years during the '08 downturn, super interesting time, and then saved up money to start my venture Bow Drape with my best friend from undergrad. And so we started a company called Bow Drape, which some of you may know, which is sort of a millennial mass customization brand, the first customization brand for women's fashion. So you can think of it like a Build-A-Bear for fashion. So very fun accessories, apparel, gifts, where you could either customize it online the way that you could customize a Nike ID shoe, or we had at our peak, 35 shop-in-shops in Nordstrom and Bloomingdale's where you could actually go in, design something, customize it to your heart's content, and then we'd make it right there for you and text you when it was ready. So very cool tech-enabled fashion company. We scaled that company past 8 figures, profitable, raised venture, raised debt, and then we sold the company in 2019 to, at the time, a roll-up. And so that was kind of my entrepreneurial journey, which was from cradle to grave. And then post earnout, I was figuring out what I wanted to do next. And we can get into a little later, just lots of reasons decided to become an investor. And so for the past now almost 5 years, I've been investing full-time at Alpaca.
Wow, that's great. And congrats on the exit, obviously, of your previous company as well. Obviously, doing all those things obviously gives you a lot of experience to help entrepreneurs with those things as you're investing. So got a lot of great experience there. All right, so let's jump back in. So Alpaca VC, you talked a little bit about the kinds of things you're looking for. what are some of the most emerging kind of trends that you're focused on or excited about right now?
Yeah, I think there's a couple big macro things. We think kind of in the macro about like what are our interest areas, and we're very thematic in the way that we approach how we think about investing. So I guess I'll touch on a couple. Like one is just thinking about the aging population. So for
That's not a
us,
shot
there's
at me
just
directly, right? That's just
yeah. There's 1 in 6 people in the US are above 65.
okay. Phew.
And so we're talking about that. And
Okay.
then like,
Good.
call it 1920, that proportion was like less than 1 in 20.
Mhm.
And so as you think about that population, there's lots of implications around like end of life technology, thinking through like the shortage of skilled labor, the transference of all these boomer SMBs, like who are they going to go to? So that's like one area we're kind of excited to think about. Another I spend a lot of time and have invested behind a lot is just the environment of consumer affordability and inflation. From food to houses, we've all lived in this inflationary environment. We've seen some of the price gouging that's
It's
happened.
crazy, right? Like go to grocery store. It's like it's kind of nuts.
Crazy. And it's like 40% of consumers just are like, prices are just way too high for me. And I like can't afford my current living situation. And so to us, there's like a bunch of things in that that come up as a result of thinking about affordability. So affordable housing is one that we think a lot about. We think a lot about like liquidation and discount as an interesting consumer channel that has popped up. Returns are kind of related to that too, as people kind of gain returns. And then there's $150 billion of excess returns in commerce every year that like brands don't know what to do with.
Yeah, where does that go? It's like
landfills.
Right, that's what I thought.
Answer.
Yeah, it's sadly.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we've been thinking a lot about like how do you create better routing? How do you get rid of those goods through different distribution and disposition and liquidation channels? And then even like what are new fintech models, that kind of create yield like products that can counteract the high inflationary period that we've been in. So thinking a lot about that. Let's see what else we've been thinking about. Maybe the last one I'll mention is around just the energy transition and like power availability. It's one that we've been thinking about as far as the real world. It's like given kind of consumer demand, the rise in EV, the rise in compute for AI, like there's just every aspect of the energy supply chain needs to be addressed. And so thinking about like grid resilient technologies, EV infrastructure, distributed energy sources, geothermal, like there's just a bunch of stuff there as we think a lot about. Another trend is like deglobalization, as we think about how to be less dependent on China, some of these other areas, like some of these trends kind of align. And so those are some of the key themes that we've been thinking about, but we're always, you can actually read at any given time any of our thoughts. We like publish everything to our website and blog, where we're letting people know like here's what we're thinking, here's where we're spending time, and here's where we see the world evolving in terms of the real world.
Great. And you can just go to Alpaca VC, correct?
Yeah, just alpaca.vc, and then you'll see it says we call them field studies, which are essentially our like research deep dives and thought pieces. So you could just see it's on the top tab and go check out what we're thinking about.
Little field notes for everyone. All right, that's great. The one thing you didn't talk about too much, which is kind of a relief but also surprising, was AI. Right? We didn't talk about that much, but you hear about it all the time.
I figured that was just everyone like.
Yeah.
I figured that was a less interesting thing to talk about. Of course, AI is like running through everything. Of course, it will change the way the business operate, in a standard way. And then, of course, there's like the AI sort of, infrastructure application layer. There's like all that stuff going on. It's so hot. Like, I don't actually feel like I don't feel like I'm going to tell you something new.
Right. Well, it's also
shows
it's become now table stakes in some ways, right? Like you expect it to be a part of every aspect of all these different companies. And when you talked about, some of the things that are happening with climate and everything else, water usage for cooling AI products or AI, it's out of control. So, I mean, there's a lot there. So a lot of things you're touching on are all kind of surrounding that topic. But
100%.
All right, so let's
Yeah.
talk about the founders. You obviously meet a lot of founders when you're evaluating potential investments. What are some of the
Mhm.
things you're looking for, traits, qualities in founders?
Yeah, it's evolved too. It's so interesting. Like, I think my bar, in a good way, you always want to raise your bar. I think my bar has risen as I've become an investor longer and longer. I think the two things that I've been gravitating to recently are kind of different sides of the same coin, which one is, I think, a proven ability to be in like a high growth or high stakes environment.
Mhm.
Um, I think in the beginning of my investment journey, I, in some ways, I just wanted I still do want everyone to succeed and like
Mhm.
believed everybody could. And so if you
Right.
had like never done a startup,
Mhm.
never, been in business, I was sort of like, well, I still think you can do it. And I
Mhm.
think you can.
Yeah.
Just my bar has risen for like, I think you need to be a little bit more proven in some way around that as a highly investable founder. Like, because it really matters when you're used to managing cash in a high growth environment, you're used to managing employees in a high growth environment, or you've been in those environments and see how that's been done. It translates very differently to the way that companies operate and the decisions they make. And so that's one thing that I look for, that I don't think I necessarily over indexed on when I first started. And then the other thing I would say, it's very subtle to try and tease out, is like, you obviously want someone who's like a magnet for
Mhm.
other people, right? Like, you want someone who's a good storyteller, who can storytell to investors, who can storytell to their employees, to potential business partners, but they need to also not have an ego. And
Mhm.
that part is kind of the subtle part to tease out, that I find is there's nuance to how you tease that out of people. One is like, I intentionally push back on people in meetings and I just see like, are
Mhm.
they defensive? Are they talking over me?
Mhm.
Are they just like, yeah, you're right, that, and just kind of move on? And the people who are magnetic, but when I push back are like, yeah, that's legit. And then like just keep going. Like, there's something there that I think makes a really good leader over time, in terms of someone who's coachable and also someone who understands and listens to both people and data. I think like is a really, really critical trait, especially early on when so much of the business is not finalized. I mean, most of our companies, if you look at some of our early winners, something like Compass wasn't what Compass was when we first invested in the company. Things pivot, you learn. And so the ego needs to like be not present in any large way. And I think that's actually like a subtle thing that sometimes if someone's just so magnetic, you kind of like look, gloss over.
Yeah, that's really good advice, and obviously good tests too for investors out there looking for others that they're trying to invest in. Also, probably really good for folks trying to find co-founders, like, or connecting with co-founders or wanting to join a company. Like, some of those things that you just mentioned will help kind of keep an eye on the ego component, which is important. And I agree with you 100%. That's really obviously being able to pivot and not be tied to something so much that
Totally.
you're just like pushing back on everything. All right, so let's move along here. So, with entrepreneurs, we're going to put the fortune teller cap on, I guess, for a second in the current business environment, I guess, which has been interesting. Like,
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many startups have been raising for a while, and if they're not AI, it's been a little bit of a slog. And
Totally.
I'm curious, some of the biggest challenges that you see or face or see entrepreneurs facing today, and obviously as we kind of move ahead in this world that's changing pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's funny because I think there's like sector specific challenges and I think there's like the
Yeah.
broadest challenges. So I guess I'll try to talk about the broadest challenges that we
Well,
see.
but also
But
to your sectors, like the sectors you're looking at. I'm curious, like what you're
yeah,
seeing. So do both.
yeah.
Yeah.
So most broadly,
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting time because the bar has risen, like for funds too, right? Like LPs are risk off or have been. They're deploying less frequently into funds. You're not seeing people raise a fund every 8 or 12 months.
Mm.
And so there's less capital being deployed and everything is tight. It's starting to loosen up, but that environment makes it so that the bar is really raised. And so companies have to think differently than they did before. Before, you could just be super high growth and have really compelling marks and like nothing else mattered. Now you kind of have two things where it's like you have to have really compelling growth, but your burn multiple needs to be pretty low, where like that growth is not coming at all costs. And you need to start to think about profitability earlier. I think it builds better companies long term, but it's harder.
Yeah.
So I think it's just a harder environment. And then I also think there are companies that won't, and there's been other people who've talked a lot about this, like just given the way that you can use AI now and in the future, like you won't need as much, over the next 10 years to get further, which is a good thing. But I think it creates more interesting and intense competition because those who are good at, using automation differently can get ahead in a more capital efficient manner and compete more nimbly because they don't need as much capital. So I also see it sort of bifurcating in that sense where like, because you see the VC landscape bifurcating, right? You have like these smaller specialized firms that I would consider us kind of like a boutique, more specialized firm. And you have the big platforms, you have the Andreessens, the NEAs, the Sequoias of the world. Like, I think capital concentrates differently over time in startups too. So like we're seeing still these massive fundraising rounds, largely AI, but also not. Like you see big supply chain rounds, we see big real estate rounds, but they're concentrating behind winners in a way that's like outsized where capital becomes a moat. And so I think that also, while competition in some way is leveled by the idea of more automation coming in through technology, like I think capital will also become a moat in the sense, like Forerunner just did a deal called Daydream. The company got $50 million out of the gate. That company's going to be hard to compete with.
Wow. Yeah. That's
because they have a lot of capital to build. And so I think that's going to be one of the challenges is like, if you're, a first-time entrepreneur, you're competing in the same space and you have someone else who's raised $50 million, like how do you do that? And so,
well, interesting. It reminds me of some of the companies over the course of like the social media kind of boom. Like that reminded me of Color, for example. Didn't they raise like a ridiculous amount of money and were shut down within a very short amount of time? So it can go bust too.
100%. There's like a graveyard of super funded companies that didn't go anywhere. I mean, I think of Spring as another one that was like a fashion company that raised a bunch of money, like couldn't break out. So it inevitably also raises the bar for those companies because you have to hit a much higher hurdle rate versus the incrementality of sort of smaller rounds. But I think given that capital is concentrating behind winners, quote unquote, more, I think it creates more interesting dynamics.
It hurts the smaller companies, obviously, right? They have to compete and obviously try to scratch their way to the surface with less, I guess.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. I just think I think it's good for the overall market though. Like I really do, as somebody who's now been on both sides, like there has consistently been a flood of capital into the market for like the last, 12 to 15 years. And so I think it's good that the bar continues to raise and that you really have to be special to break out. Like, I think that's a good thing. I think entrepreneurs just need to look themselves in the mirror and know what ride they're on. Like, I think that's probably the thing that destroys the most value is everybody puts on this mask that like everyone's crushing it and everyone's going to be a multi-billion-dollar company. And at some point as an entrepreneur, I think you have to be realistic with yourself of like, what ride am I on? Am I on that rocket ship? Or is this company still sustainable, but just not on that ride? And I think entrepreneurs and investors alike, like sometimes don't come to terms with that quick enough. And I think it destroys value.
Got it. Yeah, that does make sense. And the other thing I was thinking about when you were talking about the bigger rounds too is, do you see that? I've seen it before, but I was curious on your thoughts. Is, you get a company that raises $50 million in a sector for something. does that just like make all the other investors not interested? Like, because it's too much, like, or do you see more investors jumping into that sector and funding the other however
I
many?
think it can go both ways.
Yeah.
I think it depends on the escape velocity of that huge incumbent. If they're heads down building for 2 years, maybe there's time or another angle to attack that market. It obviously shows that there's investor conviction that there's an interesting space. So in that way, it validates the space. But on the flip, obviously, if that company starts to be incredibly dominant, like new entrants become harder. So I almost think of it as like there's like a time window where competition makes sense. And then depending on how the company fares, it changes those dynamics.
Yeah, definitely. What are some kind of things you learned along the way, either from your entrepreneurial journey or from, investing that, obviously seem painfully obvious, but, maybe not at the time. They were a little more complex.
Yes. I think one of the biggest ones about me, like growing up as a business person in tech, just given that tech is such, how it is. It's small, it's super connected, it's very network driven. It's you help me intro to this person, I help you intro to this person, goodwill will come around. Like there's a lot for me. And I don't know this for sure, but I expect it to be true, especially as a woman in tech, where women are expected to help and be helpful, that I did not set good boundaries early on. I said yes to everything, every request, every proposal to be an advisor, every ask for an introduction, no matter how small, from like a high schooler to, someone that I had worked with a decade ago. I didn't want to be unhelpful and be seen as a bitch. And I think it's absolutely the wrong way to go about it. Yeah. Like,
it's definitely double standard. Men could do that and not be looked at as a bitch. So,
well, that's true.
Yeah, so I think that's definitely an issue. So I see where you were trying to overcorrect.
Right, you're like trying to overcorrect, but it's also like you're diluting the value of your time, right? Like if you're just giving it away for free to everyone, like how valuable is your time? And your time is important. And so being judicious and upfront with people to say, I'm honored, I'm flattered, I can't commit to this right now. Saying no, essentially, is what we're talking about. Boundaries and saying no and
protecting yourself, right? Like protecting your time. And obviously with that, your mental health and time and effort around everything else you're doing.
Totally. And it actually makes it that I found I was so scared of the fallout of that. It's only been positive for me because people know that like my time is super valuable, just like everyone else's. And so that's been probably one of the biggest learnings, which just affects every part of, whether you're an investor or an operator, being protective of your time, I think is probably the biggest. It sounds obvious, but a non-obvious learning.
Well, let's talk really quickly. So you said there's a way of doing it in a nice way. So maybe for folks that are listening, what is the right way to say no and not come off as,
bitchy?
Well, just looking back, like you don't care, but you do care, but you can't physically do everything that everyone asks you to do.
100%. Yeah. I say, I just got a request the other day. Again, like this was like a friend from college's girlfriend, now wife, is starting a company and said that she had thought of me as an advisor. And I said, I'm super flattered. Thank you for thinking of me. I'm not taking on more advisory commitments at this time.
How many advisory commitments do you have right now?
Not many. I think I have some old ones, like maybe 2 or 3. But I'm not that active in them anymore.
Right. But you do have, what did we talk? You said 6 board seats right now? You're on 6 boards officially.
Yes.
How do you even do that? I don't even know.
It's someone once said to me that venture is like institutionalized ADD. And I think that's like the most accurate description. It's like juggling a bunch of different things all at once. And so to me, it's about just being super focused, where it's like, I always read the board materials. I am on a text basis with all my founders. I make sure that I get the updates that I need to, but it's always a struggle because it's like, when it rains, it pours, you know,
There's always
like
another train coming, right? Like with 6 board seats, there's always another.
Or like, you know, like you could see, like I'm like about to pop. I'm like 2 or 3 weeks out from maternity leave. And like, I think 2 or 3 of my companies are going to go out to raise while I'm out. And so it's like, just stuff happens. And so you just have to be really nimble and switch gears really well.
Well, first off, congratulations on the new startup coming out here soon in a couple weeks.
Yeah.
That's going to be a
my
lot of
biggest
fun.
incubation yet.
and one of the hardest things you can ever do. So congrats on that. That's really exciting. All right. So let's talk a little more about Alpaca. I love alpacas. So let's talk about Alpaca VC. Let's talk about like overall, like you've been with the company now for 5 years. Is that right? Or as a VC?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. What are some of the things that you've seen, like from a long-term goal perspective? What are you guys looking to do with the VC firm, and kind of as you continue to support startups?
Yeah, we want to be the best early stage investor, and we think that means a couple things. One, we think that means sticking to the lanes that we know. So as I mentioned, we love investing in things that sort of touch the real world and interject the technological into the physical. Like we're not probably going to stray too far from that. Like we're not going to go into deep tech. Like we're not going to be bio investors. So one, we think it means staying in your lane. Two, we think that means being small. We think early investors, early VCs, it's really hard once you get above 200 million per fund in AUM to return cash on cash. Just given the ownership targets you need and the amount of companies, like our thought is actually small is better. And so our goal is to actually stay small, stay partner led, work with companies really deeply, and continue to stack these kind of smaller funds over time. So that's our goal over, the next 10 years.
Great. That's great. I like that, being nimble and obviously being able to take care of the companies that you do invest in real thoroughly. I think that's great. So, all right. So we talked a little bit about some of the things that, from an advice perspective. Is there any other insights or anything? And we're going to, actually, I should mention, we're taking some questions from the audience too. There is an audience here from the Start of the Year community. So I've got a list here that we'll start those in a second, but let's start those first, and then we'll go to that final kind of advice that you might have. All right. So what are some interesting startups that you've seen this year, and why? What are some of the most interesting companies that you're excited about?
Ooh, let's see.
And I mentioned it's hard to pick favorites when you have a lot of different things you're juggling. So
it's also like I'm so biased because obviously the ones that I think are most interesting are my portfolio.
Right. That makes sense.
I was gonna say there's I guess I'll
maybe
talk
not most
about
interesting, just some interesting things you've seen. Like
some interesting things that I've seen. Yeah. I guess there's 2 companies I'll talk about that are in my portfolio that are interesting. One, I've made a couple consumer social bets recently, which is so like me zagging when everyone's zigging. Like everyone is sort of anti-consumer. And I actually think the ground is ripe, especially for Gen Alpha that's now coming up into high school, that they are looking for new ways to kind of communicate and hang out. And I've seen a couple interesting companies thinking about how you do that IRL and facilitate that IRL, as well as facilitating that online in a healthy, more creative, more expressive way. I think the current channels that we have for social media and digital communication are pretty fraught, and that's been well documented now. So that's been an interesting space where I've been digging in.
That's really cool. I mean, you said, some of these social channels, you don't realize they've been around for 15 or 20 years now. Like it's not like they're brand new. This is the same things over and over again. So yeah, I can see
even that. TikTok, right? It's like the incumbent, and it came to the US 7 years ago.
Right.
Like, it's been
the time is flying by.
Yeah. So that's kind of an interesting space. I've been spending time, have also been spending a ton of time thinking about the supply chain and how we fix certain pieces of the supply chain. So have been looking at companies, one, that collapse the supply chain from the manufacturer to the end consumer. Like it right now, the way it works, is you're largely manufacturing overseas. Those goods get shipped all over the world. Sometimes they get consolidated, sometimes not. They land eventually, if you're a US customer, in the US, and then they have to get like reshipped out. And then if you're a global brand who's based in the US, like you then ship those things back out globally once, so sometimes goods go around the world twice before they reach the end consumer.
Oh my God. That just seems like a lot of extra energy being used.
It is a lot of extra time, cost, energy.
Yeah.
And so been thinking a lot about that. So there's a couple really interesting companies that we've seen and invested behind that are collapsing that, whether that means creating a global consolidation point where if you want to go global as a brand, you could just have one hub and deliver to 50 countries from day one. And it's going to be cheaper and faster than if you were to do it the old way. So like, that's really interesting. We've also seen a company and backed a company that essentially the way Shein is like one of the largest, new entrants in the fashion space, doing above 20 billion in revenue. And they have such secret sauce because they have created, using a lot of AI as well, like a way to farm out goods just in time so that they're not creating a lot of inventory. And a lot of the inventory is like sold online before it's even shipped. So they've kind of collapsed the supply chain and then shipped it globally. Like, what if you could do that for like every brand? Like, what if you started a t-shirt brand?
I was just going to ask you about this. If I wanted to start a t-shirt brand, how would I do it?
So like the way that you would traditionally is like, if you wanted to make your own products, the MOQs are really high. Sorry, minimum order quantities, MOQs, are very high. Like sometimes if you're in China, it's like in the thousands. Right. And so it's a big capital exposure for you. You have to make everything, outlay the capital, then you have to bring it to the States, and then it's on you to sell through it. Like we've invested behind some companies that like completely dissolve that. So like you could design your t-shirts. You have zero MOQs, zero minimums to make them. And the company allows you to drop ship them directly from China. So you don't even have to touch the goods. Yeah. So it like changes I think the future of brands, as we've seen, is completely atomized across, creators and the internet. Like social media has made it so that everybody can have a brand. Yeah. And those people are not in the business of creating, SKUs and holding inventory and all of that. And so I think if you can rethink the supply chain for them, that makes it that creators and smaller brands do what they do best, which is like market, create content, create interesting brand affinity, and you can like collapse the supply chain for them. I think there's a huge opportunity there. So I've been spending a lot of time there too. That's
really interesting. Is that a specific company that you want to give a shout out to or no?
I can't yet. They're like so stealth, but they're doing so well. They're like in their first year, they'll like reach, what is it? 7 figures. Yeah.
Wow. That's great.
7 or 8 figures. 8 figures.
So wow. Wow. Yeah. So can't wait to hear what that is. And I'll get my t-shirt brand, probably would just print a big llama on it. Anyway, or Bigfoot. I don't know. We'll see. So keep moving on here. So what are some of the areas here's another question from the audience. What do you think are any areas of investment that seem overhyped to you? Like what areas?
The obvious one is AI.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like the valuations are insane. And there are some companies where, again, like we talked about earlier, like capital is a moat, and some of these core LLMs, like they raised, a gajillion dollars and that will serve them, but I think there's a lot of things that are AI that are not going to promise what they deliver. And so I think that area is overhyped. That's probably the glaring one.
Yeah. That's what I figured too. Yeah. All right. Another question from the audience, and then we can kind of jump back in. We're getting close to time here too. Bow Drape, was acquired by Winn Brands in 2019. Can you talk, walk us through what that emotional and strategic journey looked like for preparing your company for acquisition? I guess I want to know more about your entrepreneurial journey and what was
about
like.
The end.
The end, which is the beginning, because now you're VC. So
totally.
Yeah.
I will say, it's funny, I was just telling an entrepreneur this yesterday. the decision to sell the company was the hardest single decision that I made as a founder. Because you are so long the sole person who is driving the momentum of the business forward. You're the one believing in it. You're the one who's like, it's going to see another day. It's rising. And then eventually, like, it takes on its own momentum, but you play that key role of always pushing everyone forward. And so the decision to say, I'm not going to be that person. And also, I think the best decision for the company is not for me to run it day to day. Eventually, was super hard. So emotionally, when the question asked emotionally, what was hard, that was the hardest decision, because you also then have to prepare a company for acquisition. You obviously are selling, Jeff Flair is one of my investors who's now at Kraft, who said companies are bought, not sold. And so what he meant by that was like, you have to kind of intercept someone's strategic priority and solve it for them.
Right.
You cannot go
it in the way that looks like this is what we're gonna do for you, right?
Well, and you actually, like, if people are good at diligence, so it's like you have to, there's a little bit of luck there, right? Of like a match.
Yeah.
Like you can't just like make something seem like someone's priority.
Right.
And so in order to do that, right, you're selling essentially, hopefully an asset, not a liability. And so there were some tough decisions there too about like, okay, we think the priority of the business is X. And so we need to like trim fat. We need to get the company's books looking super good. Like there was a lot of like hard decisions that way as we were positioning the business for acquisition. The business was profitable, but we had to let some people go. We had to like pause on some really exciting strategic initiatives. We were about to open like 5 micro stores, for example, like of our own.
Wow.
Like we were going to open like bachelorette stores in like Nashville where you could come in with your friends and like customize, like would have been great, but like they were hard decisions that needed to be made where we were like, this business is not going to look good if we like just open all this debt to fund these new stores. So in that way, people also don't talk about that of like positioning a company for acquisition. There's a lot of like art to finessing the company.
I mean, it changed your strategy. It literally changed your strategy. You couldn't do what you were going to do because you had to be ready to go, like cleaned up and ready to go.
Totally.
More simplified, I guess.
More streamlined.
Streamlined. Yes. Yeah. Streamlined. Yes.
And so those things were difficult. Like those were the more difficult decisions to make. Because they're not your typical when you're just trying to optimize for like growth in the future and all that stuff. So, and that way I found it the hardest time. I mean, my co-founder and I, many nights were just sitting with Excel in the wine bar downstairs from our office, just drinking wine and like making sure that the books look good. And like I said, because companies are bought, not sold, like there's a lot of luck involved. I think most people don't realize that too. Like we got lucky. Like good companies just don't necessarily find a good home.
I mean, we're all on a time clock, right? I mean, that's the thing. You're all on a clock unless you're, especially once you take a venture, you're definitely on a clock to the next round or to the exit or to whatever you're trying to work towards. But I think, I guess sometimes time runs out for people, unfortunately.
Totally.
And that's where you were obviously sometimes better to be lucky than good too. So, but I think you were both. So that's good. All right. So let's talk a little bit more. I guess there's one more question and then we'll give some final thoughts. This question is actually, I said some research. It looks like you're in Brooklyn, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Green Point.
So this one's about Brooklyn, actually. I wanted to ask about your local environment. Has it influenced your work, both as an investor or as a creator? And are you seeing any local trends or shifts that have caught your attention?
Oh, that's an interesting question. New York has such startup energy right now. So New York, I think Brex put out a report, like first time in a long time this year, like we are outpacing San Francisco in terms of early stage deals getting done. So there's just so much energy. After COVID, I feel like so many young people moved to New York, and people who were working remotely that said I could live anywhere, like moved in. And so there's just this really young energy around the city. And so that's been really exhilarating to like be in the mix of this time in New York where it's like, wow, we're really we have an established network of successful companies where now those operators that were in those high growth environments are breaking away to start things. And then you have this flood of new people coming in. So in that way, I think New York, my my like PSA for New York is like, if you're a young person there, it's an amazing place to find great talent and great investors. And the energy here is palpably more exciting than in San Francisco, I could say. And then as far as like Brooklyn, like it's funny. It's not that I necessarily intended to be a Brooklyn person. We had like a 10,000 square foot factory like down the road from where I am in Greenpoint. And so I just set up here because I wanted to walk to work. And Brooklyn has become it's the creative epicenter of the city, and I would argue then the world. And so there's just like an amazing overflow of like people coming from all over the world, in terms of not just startup, but like music, art, like all the cool stuff that makes New York cool. That definitely, it's like why I love being here and why I put up with like living in a shoebox and paying an inordinate amount of money and garbage on my street and rats and like all the things that like make New York like gritty. It's also what makes it great.
Yeah, definitely. That's interesting. And hopefully don't start a war with San Francisco right here, but it does. I mean, no, I'm just kidding. There's been obviously a lot of changes in San Francisco, and obviously COVID affected that. And I think they're trying to bounce back, and a lot of other cities are rising too. But that's great to hear that it's back as far as New York, because especially Brooklyn, it's, there was such I saw it up here. I'm up in Maine, and people, like half of New York lived up here and during COVID. I feel like
totally.
Some
and then
left,
everyone like
some
moved
didn't,
back.
Yeah, exactly.
It's so funny. It's like so many people, like I remember I had a friend who like moved to LA and he like bought a house and all this stuff, and then he moved back. It's like,
yeah,
it's hard. New York has a way of just like continuing its like amazing inertia. So
that's good.
Definitely hasn't gone away. Yeah.
That's good to hear. All right. Anything else going on with you with Alpaca, or anything you're working on that you want to share? And then we'll kind of share your final thought or advice for any listeners out there.
We're investing. I think that's like the main thing for people to know. Some funds like are like in the process of raising. I also think in this environment, a lot of funds will go away and won't be able to raise another fund. And so I just think it's important for people to know we're like open for business. Like we're on fund 3. We have like 8 positions left. We're like very much in business. So pitch us, find us.
That's great. Just go to alpaca.vc and you can find Alpaca and be part of the pack.
The herd. We say the herd.
The herd. Yeah. All right. Any final thoughts or advice you'd like to share with any listeners that are here?
Yeah, I saw in our pre-read, it was funny. I was thinking about this because in a pre-read, it said like, okay, if somebody like really has the entrepreneurial bug, like what advice would you give them? And I guess my thought was, there's 2 things. One was sit with that idea for 2 to 3 months. Don't jump to do it. But like, I think a lot of people get excited about idea and then it like really fizzles. And so I think my first advice is like, see if every day you get up for months on end, just excited about the idea, and see if you can like de-risk that idea and prove to yourself that idea is not worthwhile. If after 3 months, you still like cannot wait to get out of bed and like have turned over a bunch in your mind and talked to people about it and it's still exciting, like then pursue it. I actually find a lot of ideas fizzle out. And I think people like jump too quickly to like not try to disprove themselves. I know I definitely was longer story, but like I jumped to an idea too soon and then like had to spend like a year pivoting around Bow Drape because I like wasn't questioning myself enough in the beginning. I was just so excited. And then the other is like make a capital plan of how the business is going to scale, and then 2x the cost and 1.5x the time. And then see if that is still exciting, because that's like the reality of what you need to do,
right? Yeah, that's what you need to go get as far as running the company. Yeah.
And so do those 2 exercises, and then after like a quarter, see how you feel about them, and then see if you're still excited. Because obviously a quarter is going to turn into 10 years before you know it, and you're going to have to be working at this thing for a long time. So I find that people
make it 3x and 2x, like just so you have enough to work with. I mean, let's just.
But I think people are like, part of, I think why people get the entrepreneur bug is they're like optimists. They're people who think that they can like change the world. And so I think taking proper time to like push your assumptions is really important in the beginning.
That is great advice. Really, really good advice. And this has been a really awesome conversation. Thank you so much, Aubrie, for being here today. And thank you to everyone that joined us from Start Your Community and all of our listeners in the podcast. This is our first podcast live we've done in this format. So appreciate you being here and being a part of it. And for anybody listening who wants to be a part of Startup the Year or has a startup idea, today is the best day to start up, not tomorrow. Do what Aubrie said. You can kind of let that thing linger in your head for a little while and then go from there. So it's a great advice, and we'll be here to help support throughout your efforts. So thanks so much for being here, and thanks, Aubrie, again.
Thanks for listening to the Startup of the Year podcast. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll be back with another episode soon.